However, right after the description of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and the failure of his attempt at collaboration with the anointed priests of the temple over there on the Temple Mount, the narrative evokes the apocalyptic prophecy of destruction and employs an explicit reference to a heavenly Son of Man, that from Daniel 7. It's Mark 13, starting from the beginning of the chapter. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." But Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And Jesus presents the apocalyptic vision of upcoming disasters. "Take heed that no one leads you astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors, or wars, don't be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. And brother will deliver up brother to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end will be saved. But when you see the desolation, sacrilege," Matthew 24 adds, further clarifies, "spoken of by the prophet Daniel, set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah,' do not believe it. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken." Now, in Jesus' prophecy appears the heavenly Son of Man from Daniel 7. I continue from verse 26. "And then they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." One notes, first, that the reference to Daniel does not limit itself to the figure of the Son of Man, but also retains its motif characteristic for Daniel 7 of the collective of God's chosen, whose triumph is linked to that of the Son of Man. Second, in Mark, that heavenly Redeemer figure could be plausibly perceived as someone other than Jesus himself, the figure who is to appear in the future. This is intrinsically connected to the question whether the historical Jesus identified himself with the heavenly Son of Man from Daniel 7, a question to which we will return later. The Danielic Son of Man motif is evoked explicitly again during the interrogation by the high priest in the context of the ultimate crisis in the face of Jesus' imminent death. I am reading from Matthew chapter 26, starting from 59. "Now the chief priests and the whole council sought false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, 'This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it again in 3 days.' And the high priest stood up and said, 'Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?' But Jesus was silent. And the high priest said to him, 'I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God.' Jesus said to him, 'You have said so. But I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." If the passage is based on an authentic Jesus saying, one may wonder also here whether or not in its original form the tradition presupposed the identification of Jesus as the future Danielic Son of Man. In both instances, we observe the transition from one distinctive redemption pattern to another, the moment when the scenario of Jesus as God's chosen anointed king, supposed to join hands with another anointed, the priest of Aaronic descent, reaches a dead end. Now, as Jesus' messianic enterprise has finally shown itself to be a failure, and Jesus himself faces an imminent death, the alternative hope linked to the Danielic heavenly Savior comes to the fore of the synoptic narrative. One may discern here a parallel to the general Second Temple Jewish switch from earthly to heavenly hope as a result of repeated disappointments. In both cases, then, we are dealing with an apocalyptic response to the crisis of existing anticipations. As noted, the victorious heavenly Son of Man of Daniel 7 is distinguished from the earthly Messiah in Daniel 9, whereas in 1st Enoch, the heavenly Son of Man is already identified as Messiah. What about the initial Jesus-centered tradition? Was it like in Daniel or like in 1st Enoch? What is the situation in the later written Gospel accounts? It is clear that the synoptic narrative already reflects the stage when such identification between Jesus and Danielic Son of Man is already suggested. It is for that end that the synoptic Gospel authors emphatically employ the same Son of Man appellation for Jesus as earthly messianic claimant and for the heavenly Redeemer figure to arrive in the future. We will see later how the book of Acts finally makes the identification explicit.